Deir ez-Zor, a Syrian city that's been on the brink and which is now almost free of the scourge of Islamic State. The following is the latest video that we've received from there, where government troops with Russia's backing are battling to drive out the remaining pockets of extremist militants. Well, the city spent 3 long years under Islamic State siege, and then on the 5th of September, that was lifted. Humanitarian convoys were soon delivering aid to the people who had been suffering there. Well, as the Syrian government regains territory, peace talks being held in the Kazakh capital Astana have also seen progress. Murat Gazdiev spoke to me earlier on this.
The talks in Astana are now over, and there is cautious optimism. The sides involved, the Syrian government, as well as the rebels and the 3 sponsor countries, that is Russia, Iran and Turkey, have agreed on the establishment of deconfliction zones in Syria, where the fighting is fiercest between rebels and the Syrian government. The 3 countries that have agreed to guarantee the deconfliction zones, that is Russia, again, Turkey and Iran, will have monitors on the ground watching for any ceasefire violations and taking action where and as necessary. We know these deconfliction zones will be set up in Idlib, in Aleppo here, in Latakia, in Quneitra and Daraa in the south of Syria, as well as in Homs province. These are areas, again, where the clashes between the Syrian government and the rebels are fiercest, and where civilians have borne the brunt of all this suffering that they have had to endure. The UN envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, as well as the Russian ambassador, have voiced cautious optimism again, and they said that if this works, this will be a big relief for the people of Syria.
First of all, in Geneva, we will be continuing talking, and not only talking, but taking actions on the humanitarian aspect, which is a natural consequence of de-escalation. The more de-escalation, the more humanitarian access.
We consider the establishment of the de-escalation zones to be a major milestone. It has served as the light at the end of the tunnel for the Syrian people and made them feel more secure. It gives hope for progress in the near future.
It's worth mentioning that these deconfliction zones aren't a new idea. They have been implemented by Russia and the United States, and by and large, they have worked. Nevertheless, it's important to bear in mind that there are factions, Nusra Front here in Aleppo and Idlib, who will try to spoil and try to ruin these deconfliction areas or ceasefires as they have in the past. So it'll be important to watch for that.
That's Murat Gazdiev in Syria. Well, Martin Jay is a Lebanon-based journalist who specialises in that region, and it is good to have you back on the programme, Martin. How important is this agreement on de-escalation zones, first and foremost, essentially those boundaries finally being agreed upon?
Well, it's not just the boundaries, it's also those particular tiny enclaves within these areas, you know, with the flashpoints, which your correspondent alluded to earlier. I think it's critically important, and I think it's really encouraging that the Russians are particularly moving very quickly to try and get some sort of resolution signed and implemented. And the reason why is because there is a real danger in Syria that now that the Assad regime forces have more or less swept across the country and are just finishing off in the last eastern corner of the country, that they've got more time and more resources now, and there's a very real danger that some of the generals within the army may well start looking to start scuffles with SDF forces, that is essentially Kurdish American-backed forces, and that's already happening to some extent with a war of words in Deir ez-Zor province, with both sides exchanging fierce threats to one another across the banks of the Euphrates. So there is a certain urgency, and I think the Russians are aware of that, because Russia, as well as Iran, and to some extent Turkey, but not so much, all have an agenda in Syria. They want to get on with Syria, they want to look forward to peace and actually rebuild the country. So I think the boundaries are very important, to answer your question, but we'll see what happens in the next few days. There's still quite a number of ambiguities about the deal that they need to tackle, though.
Yeah, one of the aspects is something we've been talking about for years, is to how effectively separate the moderate opposition, those who actually are agreeing upon to a peaceful opposition, and terrorists who have infiltrated their ranks, the likes of Jabhat al-Nusra and, of course, ISIL. They're going to be issues now that have to be faced up to, right?
Yeah, well, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the al-Qaeda coalition, if you like, in Idlib province, which Nusra is part of. And these are, you know, some of the fiercest groups outside of what we've been used to with the sort of fighting with ISIS. So, I mean, that's going to be a real issue. They're not going to give up very easily. But you also have raised a very important point, though. The FSA soldiers, which we've called rather kindly, I think, over the years, moderate rebels, and they're not always moderate in all cases. But the big question will hang over them. You know, what do they do? Do they get some sort of a peace deal where they give up their arms and go back to their villages? For so long, Turkey has been running them and giving them instructions, so there's also an issue there. I mean, it must have been quite fascinating to have Turkey around the same table with Iran and Syria. Imagine the atmosphere of those people in the same room when you consider that the FSA, at the very beginning, if you cast your mind back to 2011, were at the forefront of the war against Assad. So there's a lot to do there, but I think the real issue will be this al-Qaeda coalition. You know, do you fight them, do you kill them, or do you strike a deal with them?
Up in the northwest of the country, near the Turkish border, is Idlib province, and it's seen a lot of recent trouble. Given that a lot of territory there is still under al-Nusra control, how do you think it's going to work there?
Well, I think that at some point we're going to be looking at some sort of a clash. And I think probably the Russians and Iranians realise that. I mean, we've already heard from the opposition groups that they're uncomfortable about Iranian troops being on the ground. This is quite unprecedented. You know, to have Iranian troops in some sort of a peacekeeping role, you know, almost like a UN mandate, alongside Turks. So I think we're breaking into new boundaries there, and I think at a certain point there is going to be some sort of a confrontation. There's no point bulking away from that. It's just a question of whether it can be contained and whether Turkey can play a critical role, because Turkey, of course, also has a completely different agenda in Idlib compared to Syria and Iran, which is that it actually wants to use that entire province as a sort of a launching platform against a Kurdish potential uprising in the future, which is something which is beginning to get recognized by regional leaders more and more each day.
Martin, thanks as always. Martin J., Lebanon-based journalist speaking to us from Beirut.